England, 1823. The coastal village of Whitford Bay had become Emma Hathaway's sanctuary and her prison in equal measure. 5 years had passed since the night that destroyed everything she had built. 5 years since accusations of negligence had stripped away her reputation as the most trusted midwife in 3 counties. Now, at 28, she survived on the meagre income from her needle and thread, taking in mending from the fishermen's wives who remembered her mother's kindness more than they believed the whispered scandals about the daughter. The cramped room above the chandler's shop smelled perpetually of tallow and brine. Emma sat by the narrow window that overlooked the harbour, her fingers moving with automatic precision as she repaired a torn sailcloth. The morning light filtered through salt-stained glass, casting pale shadows across her work table. Her brown hair, once carefully arranged in the fashionable styles befitting a viscount's daughter, now hung in a simple braid down her back. The green eyes that had once sparkled with confidence during her training now carried the wary caution of someone who had learned that the world could turn against you in a single night. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Mrs. Copeland, the chandler's wife, entered without waiting for invitation, her round face flushed with excitement. "Miss Hathaway, the spring fair has begun in the square. You should take a respite from your work. The fresh air would do you good." Emma hesitated. The fair meant crowds, and crowds meant curious stares from those who remembered who she had been before disgrace found her. Yet the confines of her room had grown suffocating in recent weeks, and the prospect of even an hour among the living world held unexpected appeal. "Perhaps for a short while," she replied, setting aside her needle. "Thank you, Mrs. Copeland." The village square teemed with activity when Emma arrived shortly after noon. Merchants had erected colourful stalls displaying everything from Flemish lace to iron cookware. The scent of roasting chestnuts mingled with the salt air, and children darted between the adults, their laughter cutting through the calls of vendors hawking their wares. Emma moved carefully through the crowd, keeping to the edges where she might observe without being observed herself. It was at the fabric merchant's stall that everything changed. Thomas Brenwick stood behind a table laden with bolts of cloth, gesturing expansively as he described the quality of his imported muslins to a pair of prosperous-looking matrons. But Emma's attention fixed not on the merchant himself, but on the small boy who knelt beside the stall, gathering fallen scraps of fabric from the muddy ground. The child could not have been more than 5 years of age. His clothes hung loose on a frame too thin for health, and his black hair fell across his face in unwashed tangles. Yet despite the grime and the obvious neglect, there was something in the way he moved that caught Emma's trained eye. He gathered the scraps with careful precision, his small hands smoothing each piece before placing it in a woven basket. When he straightened briefly to adjust his grip on the basket, Emma saw his profile clearly for the first time. Her breath caught in her throat. The shape of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, even the way he tucked his chin when concentrating, all carried echoes of someone she had known. But it was when his sleeve rode up as he reached for a distant scrap that Emma's world tilted on its axis. There, on the boy's right shoulder blade, clearly visible in the spring sunlight, was a birthmark in the unmistakable shape of a crescent moon. Emma's legs nearly gave way beneath her. She gripped the edge of a nearby cart to steady herself, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she feared it might be audible to those around her. That mark, that singular, distinctive mark, belonged to one family alone. The Greymonts had carried it for 7 generations, each male heir bearing the crescent moon on his right shoulder as surely as he bore the weight of the ducal title. But the heir to Carlsford had died 5 years ago. Emma herself had been there, had held the cold, lifeless body in her own hands before Marguerite Whitford, the governess who had assisted with the difficult birth, declared the infant beyond salvation. The Duchess had followed her son into death before dawn, and Emma had been cast out in disgrace, accused of negligence that had cost the Duke of Carlsford both wife and heir in one terrible night. Yet here stood a boy of exactly the right age, bearing the mark that could not be forged or coincidentally replicated, working as little better than a servant for a merchant of middling respectability. Emma forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly despite the storm of implications crashing through her mind. She waited until the matrons completed their purchases and moved away before approaching the stall. Brenwick looked up with the professional smile of a man accustomed to assessing the worth of potential customers. His expression flickered with faint disappointment when he took in Emma's plain dress and worn shawl. "Good day to you, mistress," he offered with perfunctory courtesy. "Something in muslin, perhaps? I have excellent rates on the plainer weaves." Emma barely heard him. Her attention remained fixed on the boy, who had moved to the far side of the stall and now sat cross-legged on the ground, attempting to fold the larger scraps of fabric into neat squares despite his obvious exhaustion. "The child," Emma said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "Is he yours?" Brenwick's expression shifted, suspicion entering his pale eyes. "He's my apprentice, purchased fair and legal from the parish orphanage 5 years past. Why do you ask?" "He seems young for such work," Emma replied, "and unwell." "He earns his keep same as any," Brenwick said, his tone growing defensive. "Now, if you've no interest in purchasing cloth, I've other customers waiting." Emma recognized dismissal when she heard it, but she could not bring herself to simply walk away. Instead, she purchased a modest length of cotton she did not need, using coins she could barely spare. As Brenwick wrapped the fabric, Emma moved closer to where the boy sat. "What is your name?" she asked gently, crouching down to his level. The child looked up with startled blue eyes, the exact shade of summer sky that Emma remembered from another pair of eyes in another time. He glanced toward Brenwick, clearly seeking permission to speak, before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "William, mistress." Emma's heart constricted. William. Not the elaborate Theodore Charles William Edmund that would have been the heir's full christening name, but the simple derivative that a child might use, or that those who did not know his true identity might have given him. "That is a fine name," Emma said, keeping her voice soft and unthreatening. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the small piece of shortbread she had purchased from another vendor. "I find I am not as hungry as I thought. Would you like this?" William's eyes widened, fixing on the offered sweet with an intensity that spoke of genuine hunger. Again he glanced toward Brenwick, who was occupied with wrapping Emma's purchase. The boy's small hand shot out with surprising speed, snatching the shortbread and concealing it within his ragged shirt before Brenwick could notice. "Thank you, mistress," William whispered, and in that moment Emma saw something else in his bearing. Despite the dirt and the obvious mistreatment, the child sat with his spine straight, his chin lifted at an angle that suggested breeding rather than servitude. These were instincts that could not be taught, ingrained habits of posture and comportment that spoke of noble blood, regardless of current circumstances. Emma rose slowly, accepting her wrapped purchase from Brenwick with mechanical politeness. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities and risks. If this child was indeed who she suspected, then the implications stretched far beyond a single life. The Duke of Carlsford, Theodore Greymont, had spent 5 years mourning not only his wife but his son and heir. Without a direct male descendant, the title would pass to a distant cousin upon Theodore's death, and the vast Greymont estates would fragment according to entailment laws. More importantly, if the heir lived, then someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception, someone with motive and means to remove an infant from his birthright. Someone like Marguerite Whitford, who had been present that night, and who, according to the gossip Emma heard even in her exile, was now preparing to become the new Duchess of Carlsford. Emma walked through the fairgrounds in a daze, her purchased fabric forgotten in her arms. She made her way back to her room above the chandler's shop and sat motionless on her narrow bed as the afternoon light faded into evening. The pieces of a terrible puzzle were beginning to assemble themselves in her mind, and the picture they formed was monstrous. That night, Emma did not sleep. Instead, she lit her single candle and began to write, documenting everything she remembered about that terrible night 5 years ago, every detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried new and damning meaning. By dawn, she had made her decision. If William was truly the heir to Carlsford, then Emma had a duty that transcended her own ruined reputation and her fear of returning to the world that had cast her out. She had sworn an oath when she trained as a midwife to protect the lives of mothers and children above all else. She had failed the Duchess Charlotte, arriving too late to save her from the hemorrhaging that claimed her life. But if Charlotte's son lived, if that small boy labouring under Thomas Brenwick's indifferent care was the child Emma had briefly held before Marguerite declared him dead, then Emma could still honour her oath. She could save the heir of Carlsford. She could expose the truth. And in doing so, she might prevent Marguerite Whitford from completing whatever dark design had begun on that terrible night 5 years ago. The memories Emma had tried to bury for 5 years rose unbidden as she sat in her small room, the candle burning low on the table before her. To understand what had happened to William, she had to return to that night, to examine every detail with the clarity that distance and suspicion now provided. She closed her eyes and let herself fall back through time to the autumn of 1818, when she had still been Emma Hathaway, respected midwife, daughter of the late Viscount Hathaway, and welcome guest at the grandest estates in 3 counties. Carlsford Manor had stood against the twilight sky like something from a storybook, its pale stone walls glowing golden in the last light of day. Emma had arrived in early October, summoned by an urgent message from the Duke himself. The Duchess Charlotte, 7 months into her confinement, had begun experiencing troubling symptoms that warranted the presence of an experienced midwife. Emma had packed her leather case with practiced efficiency, checking each implement and supply before making the journey from her late father's modest estate to the ducal seat. The Duke of Carlsford, Theodore Greymont, had greeted her in the entrance hall with barely concealed anxiety. At 29, he had inherited his title young after his father's sudden death, and the weight of responsibility sat heavily on his broad shoulders. His black hair had been slightly dishevelled, as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and his blue eyes held the haunted look of a man facing possibilities too terrible to speak aloud. "Miss Hathaway," he had said, gripping her hand with more force than etiquette required. "Thank God you have come. Charlotte has been unwell these past weeks, and the London physician seems unable to provide either diagnosis or comfort. I shall examine her Grace immediately, Your Grace," Emma had replied. "The symptoms you described in your message suggest nothing beyond the normal discomforts of late pregnancy, but I would prefer to assess the situation myself." She had been led upstairs to the Duchess's chambers, a suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams that should have been restful but instead felt oppressively warm. The Duchess Charlotte lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her fair hair damp with perspiration, despite the coolness of the October evening. She had been beautiful once, Emma could see, but pregnancy and illness had drawn her features tight, leaving her looking older than her 26 years. "Miss Hathaway," Charlotte had whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. "They tell me you are the finest midwife in England. I pray they speak truly." Emma had taken the offered hand gently. "I shall do everything in my power to ensure your health and that of your child, Your Grace. Now, let us see what troubles you." The examination had revealed complications. The child lay in an awkward position, and Charlotte's body showed signs of strain that concerned Emma deeply. She had recommended bed rest, specific dietary adjustments, and careful monitoring. The Duke had agreed to everything, his relief palpable at having someone who spoke with authority about his wife's condition. It was during those first weeks at Carlsford Manor that Emma had first truly noticed Marguerite Whitford. The governess, though there were no children in the household to govern, had inserted herself into the Duchess's care with a persistence that Emma found peculiar. Marguerite was a handsome woman of perhaps 30 years, with pale blonde hair arranged in elaborate braids and cold brown eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. She dressed with a richness inappropriate for her station, and her manner carried an authority that exceeded what a governess should possess. Emma had commented on this once to Mrs. Wesley, the housekeeper, who had been with the Greymont family for 30 years. "Miss Whitford has ideas above her station, if you ask me," the older woman had confided in a low voice. "Came to us 5 years ago with excellent references, meant to prepare for children that never arrived. The previous Duchess, the Duke's mother, liked her efficiency, but now that Duchess is gone these 3 years, and Miss Whitford has made herself indispensable in ways that unsettle the staff." "In what ways?" Emma had asked. Mrs. Wesley had hesitated before answering. She controls access to the family apartments. She reviews all correspondence before it reaches His Grace. She has dismissed 3 footmen and 2 maids in the past year for what she calls impertinence. And she wears that brooch, the one with the crest, as though she has every right to it. Emma had indeed noticed the brooch. It was an antique piece, gold and sapphires arranged in a heraldic design that Emma recognised from her father's books on peerage. The crest belonged to the Whitford family, minor barons whose line had failed 2 generations past when the last heir died without issue, and their estates were sold to pay gambling debts. How Marguerite had come by the brooch, and why she wore it so openly, were questions that niggled at the back of Emma's mind. The crisis had come on the 3rd of November, 6 weeks before the Duchess was due to deliver. Emma had been reading in her chamber when a housemaid burst through the door, her face white with panic. "Miss Hathaway, come quickly! The Duchess has started her labour!" Emma had raced through the corridors to Charlotte's apartments, her medical case clutched in one hand. She found the Duchess writhing in pain, her bedsheets soaked with blood, while Marguerite stood at the bedside with an expression of grim satisfaction that seemed oddly inappropriate for the emergency at hand. "Her waters broke an hour ago," Marguerite reported crisply. "I sent for you immediately, of course, but the labour is progressing rapidly." Emma pushed aside her discomfort with Marguerite's presence and focused on her patient. The examination confirmed her worst fears. The child was coming far too early, and the positioning was dangerous. She would need all her skill to bring both mother and child through this alive. "I need hot water, clean linens, and the instruments from my case sterilised immediately," Emma commanded. "Someone fetch the Duke and tell him to send for Dr. Pemberton from the village. And I need absolute quiet in this room, everyone out except Miss Whitford." She had not wanted Marguerite present, but protocol demanded that an unmarried midwife have a chaperone during such intimate procedures. The other women fled, leaving Emma and Marguerite alone with the labouring Duchess. The hours that followed blurred together in Emma's memory. Charlotte's screams echoed through the corridors, despite Emma's best efforts to ease her pain. The child was not cooperating, fighting its way into the world at a dangerous angle. Emma worked by candlelight and instinct, her hands performing procedures she had practiced 100 times, praying that experience would be enough. It was past 11 o'clock when the child finally emerged with a lusty cry that momentarily drowned out even Charlotte's exhausted sobs. Emma caught the infant, a boy, small but breathing strongly. She cleared his mouth and nose with practiced movements, relief flooding through her as the baby's cries grew stronger rather than weaker. "A son, Your Grace," Emma said, her voice shaking with emotion and fatigue. "You have given the Duke an heir." Charlotte managed a weak smile before another wave of pain contorted her features. The afterbirth, Emma realised with growing alarm. Something was wrong. "Miss Whitford, take the child," Emma instructed, quickly wrapping the infant in a clean blanket and placing him in Marguerite's waiting arms. "Keep him warm and clean. I must attend to the Duchess." Marguerite accepted the bundle with an unreadable expression, her brown eyes fixed on the small, squalling face. Emma turned back to Charlotte, whose bleeding had increased to a dangerous level. She worked frantically, applying pressure, administering what medicines she had, but the hemorrhaging would not stop. "Miss Hathaway." Marguerite's voice cut through Emma's concentration. "We are running low on laudanum and clean linens. The stores are kept in the still room on the ground floor. You should fetch them yourself, as you know precisely what is needed." Emma hesitated. Leaving a patient in Charlotte's condition went against every instinct. But Marguerite was correct that Emma knew her supplies better than anyone else, and the journey would take perhaps 20 minutes at most. "Watch her closely," Emma said, already moving toward the door. "If the bleeding worsens, apply pressure here." She demonstrated the technique. "I shall return as quickly as possible." She had run through the darkened corridors of Carlsford Manor, her mind focused entirely on the supplies she needed. The still room was in the oldest part of the house, down a maze of servants' passages that Emma had learned during her weeks in residence. She gathered what she required, her hands shaking slightly from fatigue and adrenaline. 20 minutes, perhaps 25. That was all the time she was absent from Charlotte's chamber. When Emma returned, her arms laden with supplies, she found Marguerite standing near the window, silhouetted against the darkness beyond. The governess held a bundle wrapped in blood-stained linen, and her expression was one of theatrical sorrow. "Miss Hathaway," Marguerite said softly, "I regret to inform you that the child has expired. He stopped breathing shortly after you departed. I attempted to revive him, but it was too late." Emma's supplies clattered to the floor. She rushed forward, reaching for the bundle, but even before she pulled back the linen, some part of her knew what she would find. The infant within was cold, far colder than any body should be after mere minutes of death. The skin had the waxy quality of flesh that had been lifeless for some time. And when Emma checked for the birthmark she had glimpsed on the child's shoulder during those frantic moments after birth, she found none. "This is not possible," Emma whispered, staring down at the dead infant. The child was crying strongly, healthy. "I heard him." "Birth defects are not always immediately apparent," Marguerite replied with smooth authority. "You yourself have said the delivery was premature. Clearly the child's lungs were not sufficiently developed. Your absence, while necessary for supplies, was unfortunately timed." Emma looked up sharply at that, hearing the implication beneath the words. But before she could challenge Marguerite's account, a weak moan drew her attention back to the bed. Charlotte lay pale as death itself, her blood soaking through layers of bandages Emma had applied before leaving. The next hours were a losing battle. Emma worked until her hands cramped and her vision blurred, but nothing could stem the tide of Charlotte's life flowing away. The Duke had come at some point, Emma distantly remembered, standing at the foot of his wife's bed, with his face a mask of anguish. Charlotte had whispered something to him, words Emma could not hear, before slipping into unconsciousness. She never woke again. Dawn found Emma sitting on the floor of Charlotte's chamber, her dress stained with blood, her mind numb with exhaustion and growing horror. The Duchess lay dead in her bed. The infant, wrapped now in white linen, rested in a cradle that would never be used. And Marguerite Whitford stood speaking in low tones to the Duke, her hand resting with inappropriate familiarity on his arm. "A tragedy," Marguerite was saying. "But we must consider that Miss Hathaway left the child unattended during the critical moments after birth. Had she remained, perhaps the boy's distress would have been noticed sooner." Emma tried to protest, to explain that the infant she had delivered had been healthy, that something was wrong with the dead child now presented as the Greymont heir. But shock and exhaustion had stolen her voice, and by the time she recovered enough to speak coherently, other servants had corroborated Marguerite's version of events. They had heard the baby's cries stop shortly after Emma left the room. They had witnessed Marguerite's frantic attempts at revival. They testified to Emma's absence during the crucial moments. Within a week, Emma had been dismissed from Carlsford Manor, her reputation in ruins. Whispers followed her everywhere. Negligent, incompetent, the midwife who had let both Duchess and heir die through her carelessness. Now, 5 years later, sitting in her small room above the chandler's shop, Emma understood what she should have realized that terrible night. Marguerite had not been attempting to help. She had been executing a plan that required the true heir to disappear and a substitute corpse to take his place. A plan that had worked perfectly, except for one detail that Marguerite could not have anticipated: the birthmark. The crescent moon that marked every Greymont male heir had not been on the dead infant Emma examined that night. She realized that now, though in her shock and grief she had not processed the significance at the time. And if the child in Thomas Brenwick's custody bore that unmistakable mark, then Emma had all the proof she needed. The true heir of Carlsford lived. And Marguerite Whitford, who had orchestrated his disappearance 5 years ago, was about to marry the Duke and eliminate any possibility of the truth emerging. Emma had 2 weeks. 2 weeks before the wedding that would make Marguerite the Duchess of Carlsford and place her in an unassailable position of power. 2 weeks to find proof that would convince a duke to believe the disgraced midwife he had dismissed in anger over the governess who had been his sole comfort in the years since his wife's death. 2 weeks to save a child who should have been raised in luxury but instead gathered scraps from a merchant's floor. Emma rose from her bed, her decision made. She would return to Carlsford, not as a supplicant begging forgiveness, but as the bearer of truth that could not be ignored. She would rescue William from his servitude, and she would expose Marguerite Whitford for the monster she truly was. The dawn was breaking over Whitford Bay as Emma began to plan. Emma's plan required careful execution and a resolve she had not needed to summon in 5 years. The morning after her decision, she rose before dawn and made her way through the quiet streets of Whitford Bay to Thomas Brenwick's shop, a cramped establishment that smelled of damp wool and cheap dye. She waited in the shadows across the street until the merchant arrived to open his premises, then followed him inside before he could bolt the door behind him. Brenwick startled at her sudden appearance, his hand moving instinctively toward the cudgel he kept beneath his counter. Recognition flickered across his features, followed quickly by wariness. "The seamstress from the fair," he said slowly. "I did not expect to see you again so soon." "Have you need of more cloth?" "I have need of the truth," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "About the boy you call William, about where you truly acquired him 5 years ago." The colour drained from Brenwick's face. His fingers tightened on the edge of his counter, and Emma saw the precise moment when he calculated whether denial or confession would serve him better. "I purchased him legal from the parish orphanage," he said. But the words came too quickly, too rehearsed. "I have papers if you doubt me." "Then you will have no objection to showing those papers to the magistrate," Emma said calmly, "along with an explanation for why a child of 5 works in conditions that violate the Factory Act provisions regarding child labour. I may be many things, Mr. Brenwick, but I am still the daughter of a viscount, and I still have connections who would find such violations of interest." It was a bluff, mostly. Emma's connections had withered along with her reputation. But Brenwick did not know that, and the mention of the Magistrate and the Factory Act had the desired effect. The merchant's shoulders sagged, and he gestured toward a door at the rear of the shop. "We should speak privately," he muttered. The back room was cluttered with crates and unsold inventory. Brenwick cleared a space on a scarred wooden table and withdrew a metal box from beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. His hands shook slightly as he unlocked it and removed a sheaf of papers. "I am not a bad man," he began, not meeting Emma's eyes. "I run a respectable business. But 5 years ago, my wife took ill, and the physicians required payment I did not have readily available. A man approached me, said he knew of a way I could earn enough to cover the costs and have some remaining for my trouble." "What man?" Emma pressed. "He gave no name. Said he represented a household that needed to place a child discreetly. The boy's mother had died, and the family wished to avoid scandal. They would pay handsomely for someone to take the child, no questions asked." Emma's hands clenched at her sides. "How much?" £50, Brenwick admitted. More money than I had seen in a year of trading. The man said the child was healthy, would make a good apprentice when he grew older. He provided papers saying the boy came from St. Catherine's Orphanage in Plymouth, but I suspected even then they were forgeries. "Why did you accept?" Brenwick finally met her gaze, and Emma saw genuine anguish in his eyes. "My wife was dying. The physicians said they could save her with the right medicines, but those medicines cost money I did not possess. I told myself the boy would be better off with me than in some orphanage, that I would treat him well, teach him a trade." He looked away again. "I have not been as kind as I intended. Business has been difficult, and the boy reminds me of my failure every time I look at him." "Did this unnamed man give you anything besides the forged papers?" Emma asked. "Any correspondence? Any way to contact him if there were problems?" Brenwick hesitated, then withdrew a folded letter from the metal box. "He left this. Instructions for the boy's care and a warning not to ask questions or attempt to trace his origins. The letter is signed only with initials." Emma took the letter with trembling fingers. The paper was fine quality, the kind used in wealthy households, and the handwriting was educated, precise. The instructions were brief and cold, listing basic requirements for William's physical maintenance, with no mention of affection or education. At the bottom, barely visible, were the initials M.W. Marguerite Whitford. Emma's suspicions crystallized into certainty. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her own pocket, ignoring Brenwick's weak protest. "The child comes with me," she said firmly. "Today, you will provide me with all documents related to his acquisition, including the receipt for the £50. In exchange, I will not report your violations to the authorities." "You cannot simply take him," Brenwick objected. "I have legal custody according to the orphanage papers." "Forged papers have no legal standing," Emma countered, "and if you force me to involve the magistrate, I will ensure he understands that you knowingly participated in the illegal purchase of a child from unknown sources." "The penalties for such actions are severe, Mr. Brenwick. I am offering you a way to avoid them." The merchant's resistance crumbled. Within the hour, Emma had every document Brenwick possessed related to William's acquisition, including a meticulously kept ledger entry recording the £50 payment to J. Morris Intermediary on November 4th, 1818. One day after the supposed death of the Greymont heir. William himself stood in the corner of the shop, watching the proceedings with wide, uncertain eyes. When Emma approached him and knelt to his level, he did not flinch, but neither did he show recognition or trust. "William," she said gently, "my name is Emma Hathaway. I knew your mother, and I was there on the night you were born. You were taken from your family through terrible deception, but I am going to bring you home. Will you come with me?" The boy studied her face for a long moment. "Will there be food?" he asked finally, and the simple question broke Emma's heart. "Yes," she promised, "and clean clothes, and a warm bed, and people who will care for you as you deserve." William nodded slowly. "Then I will come." They departed Whitford Bay that same afternoon. Emma had sold every possession of value she owned to purchase seats on the mail coach to London, and she clutched William's hand tightly as they boarded, half expecting Brenwick to change his mind and pursue them. But the merchant remained in his shop doorway, watching their departure with an expression of relief and regret in equal measure. The journey to London took 3 days, as Emma had anticipated. They travelled through countryside slowly awakening to spring, past fields where farmers worked their ploughs and villages where church bells marked the passage of hours. Emma had packed what little food she could afford, and she watched William devour each portion with the desperate efficiency of someone accustomed to scarcity. But it was during the quiet moments between stops that Emma truly began to understand the magnitude of what had been stolen from this child. Despite 5 years of neglect and servitude, William's natural bearing persisted in ways he could not control or disguise. He sat with his spine straight, even when exhausted, unconsciously mimicking the posture of nobility. His vocabulary, though limited by lack of education, contained words and phrasings beyond what a merchant's apprentice should know. When they passed a group of fine horses being exercised in a field, William pressed his face to the coach window with unmistakable longing, describing the animal's qualities with an accuracy that startled Emma. "That one has excellent conformation," he said, pointing to a black stallion. "Strong hindquarters, good depth of chest. He would make a fine hunter." "How do you know such things?" Emma asked. William frowned, clearly uncertain. "I do not know. I simply do. When I see horses, I know what makes them valuable. Mr. Brenwick said I was foolish for noticing such things, that I should attend to my work instead." Emma felt fresh anger toward Brenwick and, more powerfully, toward Marguerite Whitford, who had condemned this child to such a life, but she kept her voice gentle as she replied, "You are not foolish, William. You notice these things because they are in your blood, part of who you truly are." It was during their second night at a coaching inn that Emma noticed William's peculiar reaction to one of the serving women. The girl was perhaps 20, with pale blonde hair arranged in simple braids. She had smiled kindly at William and offered him an extra portion of bread, but the boy had recoiled visibly, pressing himself against Emma's side with his eyes fixed on the floor. After the girl departed, confused by his reaction, Emma asked gently, "William, why did you withdraw from that woman? She meant you no harm." William's small face creased with concentration. "I do not like women with hair that colour," he said slowly. "They make me feel strange, frightened, though I cannot say why." Emma's breath caught. "Do you remember anything from when you were very small? Perhaps a woman with blonde hair?" William closed his eyes. struggling with memories that existed more as sensation than image. "Sometimes I have dreams," he admitted. "Not pictures, but feelings. Of being warm and safe, and then suddenly cold and alone. And there is yellow hair, like that woman's, but I cannot see the face. Just the hair, and the feeling of being taken away from somewhere I belonged." It was as close to confirmation as Emma could hope for. An infant would not retain visual memories, but the emotional trauma of separation might well persist as instinct and dream. Marguerite's blonde hair, her presence during those crucial moments when she had removed the living child and replaced him with the dead infant from the unfortunate servant girl Agnes, had imprinted on William's developing mind in ways that even 5 years could not erase. On the third day of travel, they reached London. Emma had one remaining contact in the city, a midwife named Alice Fletcher, who had trained alongside Emma's mother decades ago. Mrs. Fletcher maintained a practice in a respectable neighbourhood and had never credited the rumours about Emma's disgrace. When Emma appeared at her door with William in tow, the older woman embraced her without hesitation. "Emma Hathaway," Mrs. Fletcher said warmly. "I knew those accusations were false. Your mother would be proud of how you have endured." "I need your help, Mrs. Fletcher," Emma said urgently. "And your testimony regarding something that happened 5 years ago." Over tea in Mrs. Fletcher's tidy parlour, Emma explained everything she had discovered. The older midwife listened with growing horror, and when Emma finished, she sat in silence for several moments before speaking. "I remember that week well," she said finally. "I was called to attend a difficult birth at Carlsford Manor's London residence. A servant girl named Agnes, barely 17, labouring with a child conceived in circumstances she would not discuss. The babe was stillborn, a boy. I wrapped the poor thing myself and arranged for burial in the servants' section of the local churchyard." "What happened to the body before burial?" Emma asked, though she already suspected the answer. Mrs. Fletcher's expression darkened. "That is what disturbed me at the time. The day after the birth, I returned to prepare the infant for burial as requested. But the body had vanished from the cold room where I had placed it. The housekeeper claimed there had been confusion, that another midwife had taken the body for burial. I made inquiries, but no one could tell me who this other midwife was, or where the burial had taken place." "Do you remember who requested the body's removal?" "The head of household staff at the London residence, a woman named Marguerite Whitford, who said she was acting on behalf of the Duke. At the time, I had no reason to question her authority." Emma leaned forward intently. "Would you be willing to provide written testimony to this effect? To state that a stillborn male infant disappeared from Carlsford Manor's London residence on the same night that the heir to Carlsford supposedly died at the country estate?" Mrs. Fletcher did not hesitate. "I will provide whatever testimony you require. If what you suspect is true, then a grave injustice has been perpetrated against this child and against the Duke himself." Iced. Emma spent the next day gathering her evidence with meticulous care. She had Brenwick's documents proving William's purchase and the payment to an intermediary. She had the letter with Marguerite's initials. She had Mrs. Fletcher's written statement regarding the disappeared stillborn infant. And she had William himself, bearing the unmistakable Greymont birthmark that no amount of deception could falsify. But she needed one more piece of proof, something that would demonstrate Marguerite's intentions extended beyond past crimes to present danger. It was Mrs. Fletcher who provided the crucial lead. "If you suspect this Whitford woman means the Duke harm, you might inquire at the chemist's shops," she suggested. "Midwives are not the only ones who purchase arsenic and other dangerous substances, but respectable chemists keep records of such sales." Emma visited 3 chemist shops before finding what she sought. At an establishment in a less reputable district, the proprietor's records showed a recent purchase of white arsenic by a woman matching Marguerite's description. The chemist had recorded the sale as being for rat poison, which was a common enough request, but the quantity purchased was far in excess of what any household would require for pest control. The lady was most specific about the form of the substance, the chemist recalled when Emma questioned him. Wanted the powder that dissolves clear in liquid. Said she had particular trouble with vermin in her pantry stores. Emma's blood ran cold. Arsenic powder that dissolved without colour or taste was the poison of choice for those who wished to kill slowly and avoid detection. Given in small doses over time, it would mimic the symptoms of natural illness, allowing the poisoner to maintain an appearance of devoted care while gradually ending the victim's life. Armed with a copy of the chemist's sales record, Emma made her final inquiries and learned what she had both hoped and feared to discover. The Duke of Carlsford was indeed to marry Marguerite Whitford. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 days hence at the Duke's private chapel in his London residence. Emma had run out of time. She returned to Mrs. Fletcher's home and spent the evening reviewing her evidence one final time. The documents spread across the table told a damning story. The timing of William's sale matched perfectly with the supposed death of the heir. The stillborn infant's disappearance provided the substitute corpse necessary for the deception. The chemist's record suggested Marguerite's plans extended beyond merely securing the title of Duchess to ensuring she would inherit the Greymont fortune outright once Theodore was dead. "Tomorrow," Emma said to William, who sat quietly in the corner, playing with a wooden horse Mrs. Fletcher had given him. "I will take you to meet your father." William looked up, confusion evident in his blue eyes. "My father, the Duke of Carlsford. You are his son, William, his true heir, and tomorrow the whole world will know the truth." That night, Emma barely slept. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would present her evidence, how she would convince a chapel full of aristocrats to listen to the disgraced midwife they had dismissed as negligent and incompetent. The task seemed impossible, yet she could not see any alternative. If Marguerite married Theodore and poisoned him successfully, William would never be able to claim his birthright. The title would pass to distant cousins, and the truth would die along with everyone who had any reason to suspect it. Dawn found Emma dressing William in the best clothes Mrs. Fletcher could provide, washing his face until it shone, and combing his black hair into some semblance of order. The boy submitted to her ministrations with patience, and when she explained that they were going to stop a wedding, he nodded as though such dramatic interventions were perfectly ordinary. "Will the Duke believe you?" William asked as they prepared to depart. Emma knelt and took his small hands in hers. "I do not know," she admitted honestly, "but I must try. You deserve the life that was stolen from you, and he deserves to know that his son lives." She gathered her documents, checked the address of the Duke's London residence one final time, and took William's hand. Together, they stepped out into the London morning, ready to interrupt a wedding and expose a conspiracy 5 years in the making. The Duke's private chapel awaited, and with it, the moment of truth that would determine the fate of the Greymont heir and the woman who had risked everything to save him. The Duke of Carlsford's London residence stood in Grosvenor Square, a magnificent example of Georgian architecture with its pale stone facade and precisely arranged windows that caught the morning light. On this particular day in late May of 1823, the private chapel attached to the East Wing had been transformed for a wedding that all of London society had anticipated, with varying degrees of curiosity and speculation. Flowers imported from the Duke's conservatories at Carlsford Manor adorned every available surface, their fragrance competing with the expensive perfumes worn by the assembled guests. Emma Hathaway stood in the shadows across the square, clutching William's hand with perhaps more force than necessary. The boy stood quietly beside her, his newly cleaned face tilted up to study the grand house with an expression that might have been recognition or simply childish awe. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched carriages arrive, disgorging aristocrats in their finest clothes. The cream of London society had gathered to witness Theodore Greymont, Duke of Carlsford, finally take a new wife after 5 years of mourning. "Are you frightened?" William asked, and Emma realized the boy could feel the trembling in her hand. "Terrified," she admitted. "But sometimes we must do terrifying things because they are right." She waited until the last guests had entered before approaching the servants' entrance at the rear of the building. The footman stationed there looked at her worn dress and William's patched clothing with obvious disdain. "Tradesmen's deliveries were to be made yesterday," he said dismissively. "You cannot enter now." Emma drew herself up to her full height and summoned every ounce of authority her Viscount father had possessed. "I am Emma Hathaway, daughter of the late Viscount Hathaway, and I carry urgent information that the Duke must hear before he speaks his vows." "You will grant me entry, or you will explain to His Grace why you prevented testimony that concerns his family's very survival." The footman hesitated, clearly torn between his orders and the unmistakable accent of breeding in Emma's voice. In that moment of indecision, Emma simply walked past him, pulling William along, and made her way through the servants' corridors toward the chapel. Behind her, she heard the footman's startled protest, but she did not slow her pace. The chapel was smaller than Emma had expected, an intimate space designed to hold perhaps 50 guests. She slipped through a side door that led to a small alcove behind the last row of pews, concealed by a carved wooden screen. From this vantage point, she could observe the ceremony without being immediately visible to the congregation. The Duke stood at the altar, and Emma's breath caught at the sight of him. 5 years had aged Theodore Greymont in ways that went beyond the silver now threading through his black hair. His face had lost the softness of youth, settling into harder, more austere lines. His blue eyes, which Emma remembered as warm when he looked at his wife Charlotte, now held a flatness that spoke of resigned duty rather than joy. He wore his finest clothes, a dark blue coat over a silver waistcoat, but he might as well have been dressed for a funeral for all the happiness his expression conveyed. The guests filled the pews in a rustling mass of silk and superfine wool, their faces alight with curiosity and the particular satisfaction that comes from witnessing the conclusion of a long social drama. Emma recognized several prominent families, earls and viscounts and their wives, all eager to see the Duke of Carlsford finally provide himself with the possibility of an heir and return fully to society. Then Marguerite Whitford appeared at the chapel entrance, and the congregation's collective intake of breath was audible. She was magnificent. Emma had to admit with reluctant admiration for the woman's audacity. The wedding gown was white silk of the finest quality, imported from France at what must have been considerable expense, with intricate embroidery of silver thread along the bodice and hem. The cut was modern, with a high waist that emphasized Marguerite's tall, slender figure, and long sleeves that ended in delicate points over her hands. Her blonde hair had been arranged in an elaborate style with pearl pins that caught the light from the chapel's windows. But it was the jewelry that made Emma's hands clench into fists. Around Marguerite's neck lay a magnificent sapphire necklace that Emma recognized immediately. It had belonged to Duchess Charlotte, a wedding gift from Theodore's mother. The matching earrings glittered at Marguerite's ears, and on her left hand, clearly visible as she processed down the aisle, was Charlotte's engagement ring, a large diamond surrounded by smaller stones. The presumption was breathtaking. Marguerite was not merely marrying into the Greymont family. She was claiming Charlotte's place entirely, adorning herself with a dead woman's treasures as though they had always been meant for her. Theodore's expression did not change as his bride approached, but Emma saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Whatever his reasons for this marriage, they clearly did not include enthusiasm for the match itself. The Archbishop of London himself had been prevailed upon to conduct the ceremony, a testament to the Duke's influence, and perhaps also to the importance society placed on seeing him properly wed. The elderly clergyman opened his prayer book and began the familiar words of the Anglican marriage service, his voice resonating through the small chapel with practiced authority. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Emma felt William shift beside her, his small body pressed against her legs as though seeking protection from the solemnity of the occasion. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but kept her eyes fixed on the ceremony unfolding before them. The Archbishop continued through the opening sections of the service, speaking of marriage as an honourable estate and the purposes for which it was ordained. Marguerite stood with her head slightly bowed, the picture of feminine modesty, though Emma noticed how her brown eyes darted occasionally toward the assembled guests, as though confirming their witness to her triumph. Then came the moment Emma had been waiting for, with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Therefore, if any man can show any just cause, why they may not lawfully be joined together," the Archbishop intoned, "let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The traditional pause followed, that brief moment of silence that almost never produced an objection, but which ritual demanded be observed nonetheless. Emma heard several guests shift in their pews, preparing for the ceremony to continue. Marguerite's lips curved in a small, satisfied smile. Emma stepped out from behind the screen, her hand still gripping William's, and her voice rang out clear and firm across the chapel. "I object to this marriage. The woman you are about to wed is a liar, a thief, and a would-be murderess. And this child is your son, your Grace, your true heir, whom she stole from you 5 years ago." The silence that followed was absolute and shattering. Every head in the chapel turned toward Emma and William. The Archbishop's prayer book slipped from his hands and clattered to the stone floor. Theodore stood frozen at the altar, his face draining of all colour as his gaze fixed on the small boy at Emma's side. Then the chapel erupted in chaos. Voices rose in shock and outrage, guests standing from their pews to get a better view of the unexpected interruption. Several women cried out in scandal. Lord Hartwick, Theodore's closest friend, moved as though to intercept Emma, but the Duke raised one hand in a gesture that froze everyone in place. "Miss Hathaway," Theodore said, and his voice was carefully controlled, despite the shock Emma could see in every line of his body. "You were dismissed from my service 5 years ago for negligence that cost me my wife and son. What possible reason could you have for disrupting this ceremony with such wild accusations?" Marguerite had gone pale beneath her carefully applied cosmetics, but she recovered quickly. "Your Grace," she said, her voice pitched to carry sympathy and concern. "This is the woman whose carelessness resulted in tragedy. She was sent away in disgrace. Clearly her mind has been affected by guilt and isolation. Perhaps we should summon the constables to remove her gently." "I ask for nothing but the opportunity to present evidence," Emma replied, keeping her voice steady despite the dozens of hostile eyes upon her. "Evidence that will prove every word I have spoken. If I am wrong, if I am mad as Miss Whitford suggests, then let that evidence condemn me. But if I am right, Your Grace, then you stand on the verge of marrying the woman who murdered your wife and stole your son." Theodore descended the altar steps slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. As he approached, Emma could see the war between hope and fury playing across his features. He stopped several feet away, as though afraid to come closer, and his gaze moved from Emma to William. The resemblance must have struck him like a physical blow. William had Theodore's black hair, the same distinctive shape to his jaw, the exact shade of blue in his eyes. Even the way the boy held himself, with unconscious, aristocratic bearing despite his poor clothing, echoed the Duke's own posture. Theodore's breath caught audibly, and his hand rose as though to reach toward the child before falling back to his side. "The boy resembles me," Theodore admitted, his voice hoarse. "But resemblance alone proves nothing. Many children might share my colouring." "Not many children bear the Greymont birthmark," Emma said. "William, would you show his Grace your shoulder?" The boy looked up at Emma for reassurance, then carefully removed his patched jacket and pulled aside the collar of his shirt. There, clearly visible on his right shoulder blade, was the crescent moon that every Greymont male heir had carried for 7 generations. Theodore staggered, as though struck. Lord Hartwick moved quickly to support his friend, gripping the Duke's arm as Theodore stared at the unmistakable mark. "Impossible," Marguerite's voice cut through the stunned silence. "The child died. I was there. Miss Hathaway herself examined the body." "I examined a body," Emma corrected, her voice gaining strength as she pressed her advantage. "A stillborn infant that had been dead for hours, not minutes. A child with no birthmark, who bore no resemblance to the living, healthy boy I had delivered earlier that evening." She reached into her worn reticule and withdrew the documents she had gathered. "I have here a receipt showing that this child was purchased from an intermediary on November 4th, 1818, 1 day after the supposed death of your heir, Your Grace. The receipt is signed with the initials M.W. "Those could be anyone's initials," Marguerite protested, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "I also have written testimony from Mrs. Alice Fletcher, a respected midwife in London," Emma continued, pulling out the second document. "She attended the stillborn birth of a servant girl named Agnes at your London residence on the same night your heir supposedly died at Carlsford Manor. That stillborn infant's body disappeared from the cold room where Mrs. Fletcher had placed it. removed by order of the head of household staff, a woman named Marguerite Whitford. The Archbishop had retrieved his prayer book and now stood watching the proceedings with the attention of a man who had presided over many human dramas, but rarely one so theatrical. Several guests had produced lorgnettes to better observe Marguerite's face, which had gone from pale to ashen. "And finally," Emma said, withdrawing the last piece of evidence with hands that barely trembled, "I have a record from a chemist's shop showing the recent purchase of white arsenic powder in quantities far exceeding what any household would require for pest control. The purchaser matched your description, Miss Whitford, and specifically requested the form that dissolves clear in liquid." Theodore turned slowly to face his intended bride. "Is this true?" "This is madness," Marguerite said, but her voice had risen to a pitch that suggested panic rather than outraged innocence. "You cannot believe these accusations based on some papers that could easily be forged. I have served your household faithfully for 8 years. I comforted you in your grief. I managed your properties with care and efficiency. You stole my son," Theodore said, and the words emerged with such cold fury that several guests gasped. "You let me believe he was dead. You let me mourn him while he was sold like chattel to a merchant and put to work like a common servant." "You have no proof of that," Marguerite insisted. "The child could be anyone. Some opportunist trained to exploit your grief." "He has my birthmark," Theodore said. "A mark that appears on no other family line. A mark that cannot be forged or fabricated." His voice grew louder. "Guards, restrain Miss Whitford while these accusations are properly investigated." 2 footmen moved forward at his command, taking position on either side of Marguerite. She tried to pull away, her composure finally cracking completely. "You are making a terrible mistake," she cried. "Everything I did was for us, for our future together. The child would have complicated everything. He would have stood between us." The inadvertent confession hung in the air. Theodore closed his eyes briefly, pain and rage warring across his features. When he opened them again, his gaze found William, who had been watching the proceedings with the solemn intensity of a child who understands that his entire life is being decided by forces beyond his comprehension. Theodore crossed the distance between them and knelt on the cold stone floor so that he was at eye level with the boy. His movements were slow and careful, as though approaching a wild creature that might startle and flee. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its hardness, becoming gentle in a way Emma had not heard since Charlotte's death. "What is your name?" he asked. "William, sir," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "William," Theodore repeated, and something in his expression crumbled. "My son was to be called William. William Theodore Charles Edmund Greymont, heir to Carlsford." He reached out one hand, still moving slowly, and touched the boy's cheek with infinite gentleness. "Will you tell me how old you are?" "5 years, sir, or thereabouts. Mr. Brenwick was not certain of my exact birth date." "You were born on the 3rd of November, 1818, Theodore said, his voice breaking slightly. "At 23 minutes past 11 in the evening. You had your mother's nose and my eyes, and you cried loud enough to wake half the household when you entered the world." His hand moved to cup the back of William's head. "And then you were stolen from me before I could even hold you." William regarded the kneeling Duke with solemn consideration. "Are you truly my father?" "I am," Theodore whispered. "And I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that no one will ever take you from me again." The boy nodded slowly, then did something that brought tears to Emma's eyes and audible sobs from several of the female guests. He stepped forward into Theodore's arms, and the Duke of Carlsford, who had maintained iron control through 5 years of grief and loss, finally broke. He gathered his son against his chest and wept openly, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Behind them, Marguerite Whitford stood between the guards, her face a mask of thwarted ambition and growing fear. The white silk wedding gown that should have represented her triumph now seemed like a costume from a play that had taken a disastrous turn. The sapphire necklace caught the light as she was led away from the altar, away from the title she had schemed for, toward consequences she had never imagined would find her. The Archbishop cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he said gently, "perhaps we should adjourn to somewhere more private to sort through these revelations." Theodore rose, still holding William in his arms despite the boy's size. The child wrapped his arms around his father's neck and buried his face against Theodore's shoulder, and the Duke held him as though he would never let go. "Yes," Theodore said. "Everyone please retire to the drawing rooms. Lord Hartwick, send for my solicitor and the magistrate. Miss Hathaway, you will accompany me." He looked at Emma for the first time since recognizing his son, and his expression held gratitude and shame in equal measure. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. You have given me back my life." Emma curtsied deeply. "I did only what I should have done 5 years ago, Your Grace. I should have trusted my instincts when I knew something was wrong. I should have fought harder against the accusations. I failed you and your son once. I pray I have made some amends today." "You have saved him," Theodore said simply. "And in saving him, you have saved me from a fate worse than death. Now come, we have much to discuss, and Miss Whitford has much to answer for." As the stunned guests filed out of the chapel, whispering among themselves about the most dramatic wedding interruption in living memory, Emma followed the Duke through the corridors of his London residence. William remained in his father's arms, and Emma noticed that Theodore's hand continually moved over the boy's back, as though reassuring himself that the child was real and solid and truly there. The wedding that should have sealed Marguerite Whitford's victory had instead become the instrument of her exposure and downfall. And the heir to Carlsford, stolen 5 years ago and presumed dead, had finally come home. The drawing room Theodore selected for the interrogation was smaller than the grand reception chambers that dominated the first floor of his London residence. Located in the east wing, with windows overlooking the private garden, it had served as his late mother's preferred sitting room, furnished with comfortable chairs upholstered in deep green velvet, and walls lined with bookcases containing volumes on subjects ranging from philosophy to agriculture. It was a room designed for intimate conversations rather than formal audiences, and its very domesticity made it an unsettling setting for the confrontation about to unfold. Theodore carried William across the threshold and settled into one of the chairs without releasing the boy from his arms. The child remained pressed against his father's chest, his small hands clutching the fine fabric of Theodore's coat with a grip that suggested he feared being torn away at any moment. Emma took a position near the fireplace, close enough to provide support, but far enough removed to allow father and son their first tentative connection. The guards brought Marguerite in moments later, positioning themselves on either side of the doorway while she stood in the center of the room. Someone had removed the magnificent sapphire necklace and Charlotte's wedding ring, leaving Marguerite's throat and hands bare. Without the jewelry, the expensive wedding gown seemed excessive, almost theatrical, a costume for a role she would never play. Her blonde hair, so carefully arranged for the ceremony, had begun to come loose from its pins, strands falling across her face in a way that made her look suddenly older and more desperate. Dr. Pemberton arrived shortly thereafter, the same physician who had attended Charlotte during her final illness. He was a man of perhaps 60 years with silver hair and the calm, assessing manner of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of human nature in his decades of practice. He bowed to Theodore before approaching to examine William, and Emma saw the Duke's arms tighten protectively around his son. "I need to verify the child's identity, Your Grace," Dr. Pemberton said gently. "It is a formality, but a necessary one." Theodore nodded reluctantly and whispered something to William that Emma could not hear. The boy loosened his grip slightly and allowed the physician to examine him. Dr. Pemberton's inspection was thorough but gentle, checking William's general health before asking him to remove his shirt so the birthmark could be properly observed. The crescent moon stood out clearly against the pale skin of the boy's shoulder blade, its shape unmistakable and distinctive. "I delivered you, Your Grace." Dr. Pemberton said to Theodore, "And your father before you. I have seen this mark on 3 generations of Greymont heirs. There is no doubt whatsoever that this child carries the blood of your family." He turned to examine the mark more closely, his fingers tracing its outline with professional precision. "Furthermore, the mark is identical in size and positioning to your own, Your Grace. This is no counterfeit or clever forgery. This is your son." Theodore's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, Emma saw tears tracking down his cheeks without shame or attempt at concealment. He helped William replace his shirt with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled the boy back into his embrace. The solicitor, Mr. Whitmore, entered last, a thin man with spectacles, and the permanently worried expression of someone whose profession required him to anticipate disaster. He carried a leather case containing papers and writing implements, and he took his place at a small writing desk near the window where he could document the proceedings. His eyes moved from Marguerite to William to Theodore, with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to witnessing family secrets. "Now," Theodore said, his voice gaining strength as he looked directly at Marguerite for the first time since entering the room. "You will explain everything. How you stole my son, why you murdered my wife, what you intended by purchasing enough arsenic to kill a dozen men." Marguerite's composure, which had been cracking since Emma's interruption in the chapel, finally shattered completely. Her shoulders sagged, and she seemed to diminish physically, as though the exposure of her crimes had stolen her ability to maintain the imperious bearing she had cultivated for so many years. "I did not murder the Duchess," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charlotte died from complications of childbirth. Miss Hathaway herself can attest to that. The hemorrhaging was beyond anyone's control. But you took advantage of her death," Emma said quietly. "You saw an opportunity in the chaos of that night." Marguerite's brown eyes fixed on Emma with hatred so pure it was almost tangible. "You should have saved her. You were the midwife. It was your responsibility." "Do not deflect blame," Theodore snapped. "Miss Hathaway did everything possible to save my wife. You, however, took my living son and replaced him with a dead child. You allowed me to believe I had lost everything when in truth you had stolen my heir for your own purposes. Explain yourself. Now." Marguerite was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving around the room as though seeking escape or inspiration. Finding neither, she straightened her spine and lifted her chin in a gesture that might have been defiance, or simply the final remnants of her pride. "I meant to spare the child," she began, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "The birth was premature. He was small and weak. I thought he might not survive in any case, and I knew of a family who desperately wanted a son. I arranged for his adoption, thinking it would be a kindness to all involved." "A kindness?" Theodore's voice was dangerously quiet. "You call stealing my heir a kindness? You had just lost your wife," Marguerite continued desperately. "You were destroyed by grief. I thought that if the child died as well, you would have closure, a clean break from the tragedy. But if he lived, you would be reminded every day of Charlotte's death. I thought I was protecting you from further pain." Emma could remain silent no longer. "You sold him for £50 to a merchant who put him to work like a common servant. That is not protection or kindness. That is avarice and cruelty." She withdrew Brenwick's receipt and the letter bearing Marguerite's initials from her reticule and handed them to Mr. Whitmore, who examined them with professional thoroughness before passing them to Theodore. The Duke read the documents slowly, his face growing harder with each line. "These bear your handwriting," he said flatly. "I have seen enough of your correspondence over the years to recognize your style. The way you form your W, the particular slant of your letters. This is your work." "I was desperate," Marguerite said, and now genuine tears began to fall down her cheeks. "I needed money. My situation was impossible." "Then explain the arsenic," Emma said, producing the chemist's record. "Explain why you purchased poison in quantities far exceeding what any legitimate household purpose would require." Marguerite's tears stopped abruptly. For a moment, Emma saw calculation in those brown eyes, as though the woman was weighing how much truth she could afford to reveal versus how much deception might still serve her. The scales apparently tipped toward confession, because when she spoke again, her voice had lost its pleading quality and taken on a harder edge. "Very well," she said. "You want the truth? I shall give it to you, though I doubt any of you have the wit to understand what drove me to such measures." "Enlighten us," Theodore said coldly. Marguerite drew herself up to her full height, and for a moment, Emma glimpsed the woman she might have been in different circumstances. There was intelligence in her face, and a certain dignity that poverty and resentment had twisted, but not entirely destroyed. "My father was Baron Whitford," she began. "Perhaps you remember him, Your Grace. He died when I was 12 years old, deeply in debt from gambling and poor investments. But before his financial ruin became complete, before the creditors seized everything, he had an affair with my mother, who worked in his household as a seamstress. When she became pregnant with me, he refused to acknowledge the child as his. My mother was cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single piece of jewelry she had stolen, this brooch with my father's crest. She reached into the hidden pocket of her wedding gown and withdrew the antique brooch Emma had noticed years ago, the one with the Whitford family crest worked in gold and sapphires. My mother educated me in secret," Marguerite continued. "She stole books from her various employments. She taught me to read and write and speak with the accent of the class that should have been mine by right of birth. But education without legitimacy is worthless. I was condemned to work as a servant in the households of people less intelligent and less capable than myself, simply because my father lacked the courage to claim his own blood. So you decided to claim what you thought you deserved," Emma said quietly, "through deception and murder." "I decided to take what should have been mine from the beginning," Marguerite corrected. "When I came to work at Carlsford Manor, I saw an opportunity. The Duchess was frail, likely to die in childbirth. The Duke was young and would need a new wife. With the heir removed as an obstacle, I could become the Duchess I was always meant to be." Theodore's arms tightened around William. "My son was never an obstacle. He was my greatest joy, stolen before I could even know him." "He would have stood between us," Marguerite said flatly. "You would have devoted yourself to his upbringing, remarried eventually for his sake rather than for love. But without him, you were vulnerable, alone, in need of comfort and support. I provided both, and I earned your trust over these 5 years. The wedding should have been my reward. And after the wedding," Emma pressed, "what then? The arsenic suggests your ambitions did not end with the title of Duchess." Marguerite's expression turned calculating. "His Grace is a wealthy man. Control of the Greymont fortune would have allowed me to live as I was meant to live, to take my rightful place in society without constant worry about money or position." "You intended to murder me," Theodore said, his voice devoid of emotion, "to become a wealthy widow." "I intended to ensure my security," Marguerite replied. "Is that so different from what every woman seeks in marriage?" The casual admission of intended murder seemed to freeze everyone in the room. Even Mr. Whitmore stopped writing, his pen hovering above the paper as though the words he had just heard defied documentation. Dr. Pemberton broke the silence. "The arsenic," he said heavily. "It would have been administered gradually, I presume. Small doses mixed into food or drink, dissolved in wine," Marguerite confirmed without apparent shame. "I had already begun the process. Small amounts that would mimic the symptoms of digestive ailments. Within 6 months, perhaps a year, His Grace would have succumbed to what would appear to be natural causes." Theodore's face had gone white. "The stomach pains I have been experiencing these past weeks, the occasional nausea and weakness, I attributed them to wedding nerves." "Early symptoms," Dr. Pemberton confirmed grimly. "Had this woman's plot succeeded, Your Grace, you would have died a slow and painful death while she played the devoted wife tending to your final illness." Theodore looked at the woman he had been about to marry, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. 5 years, he said. 5 years you have been in my household, pretending loyalty while plotting murder and maintaining the theft of my son. What manner of creature are you?" "A survivor," Marguerite replied without remorse. "The world gave me nothing. I took what I needed to survive in advance. Is that not what men do every day without censure? Men do not steal children and poison their benefactors," Emma said sharply. Theodore rose from his chair, still holding William, and approached Marguerite until only a few feet separated them. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the fury in it was unmistakable. "You stole 5 years of my son's life. 5 years in which he was treated as a servant, worked like a common labourer, denied his birthright and his family. You murdered my wife through your interference, though I cannot yet prove how. And you intended to murder me and leave my estates to be divided among distant cousins who care nothing for the land or the people who depend on it. For these crimes, you will face the fullest extent of justice." He turned to Mr. Whitmore. "Document everything she has said. Prepare charges of attempted murder, fraud, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Contact the magistrate immediately." "The merchant Thomas Brenwick," Emma added. "He knowingly purchased a child through illegal channels. He should face charges as well." "Agreed," Theodore said. 10 years in prison should provide him ample time to reflect on the consequences of his actions. "As for Miss Whitford," he looked back at Marguerite with cold finality, "I believe the penalty for attempted murder of a peer is still death. Is it not, Mr. Whitmore?" The solicitor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Given the evidence and her confession, Your Grace, she will almost certainly face the maximum penalty. However, there are occasionally mitigating circumstances that allow for transportation or life imprisonment instead of execution." "There are no mitigating circumstances," Theodore said flatly. "This woman has proven herself capable of any atrocity in service of her ambitions. I want her removed from society permanently." Marguerite finally seemed to understand that no amount of explanation or justification would save her. Her face crumpled, and she sank to her knees on the carpet, her expensive wedding gown pooling around her in an ironic parody of supplication. "Please," she whispered. "I did not mean for it to go so far. I only wanted what should have been mine." "You wanted what belonged to others," Theodore corrected, "and you destroyed lives to obtain it. Guards, remove her. She will be held in custody until the magistrate arrives." As Marguerite was led from the room, still pleading for mercy that would not come, Theodore finally allowed himself to collapse back into his chair. William remained in his arms, and the boy had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, absorbing revelations about his own stolen childhood, with the solemn acceptance of a child who had learned early that the world could be cruel and capricious. Theodore looked down at his son, and Emma saw his expression soften from fury to something approaching wonder. "You are truly here," he whispered. "After 5 years of mourning, of believing you dead, you are here in my arms." William looked up at his father with those startling blue eyes. "Are you going to send me away again?" The question broke Theodore completely. He pressed his face against William's hair and wept openly, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed and denied. "Never," he said when he could speak again. "I swear on everything sacred that you will never be taken from me again. You are my son, my heir, and I will spend the rest of my life making amends for the years that were stolen from us both." Emma watched father and son cling to each other, and she felt the tight knot of guilt and responsibility that had lived in her chest for 5 years finally begin to loosen. She had not saved Charlotte, and that failure would haunt her always, but she had saved Charlotte's son, and in doing so, she had prevented Marguerite from completing an evil that had begun on that terrible night 5 years ago. Dr. Pemberton approached Theodore gently. "Your Grace, the boy should be examined properly. 5 years of poor nutrition and inadequate care may have consequences that require treatment." Theodore nodded, but seemed reluctant to release William, even for medical examination. Emma stepped forward. "Perhaps I might remain with them during the examination, Your Grace. William knows me, and my presence may make the process less frightening." Theodore met her gaze, and in his eyes, Emma saw gratitude and something else, a question perhaps, or the beginning of a realization that would take time to fully form. "Yes," he said, "please stay. Stay as long as William needs you, as long as we both need you." The first weeks of William's return to Carlsford Manor unfolded with a delicacy that surprised even those who witnessed it. Theodore had ordered the London residence closed immediately after Marguerite's arrest, unable to bear remaining in the house where he had nearly married his wife's murderer and his son's kidnapper. The household relocated to the Carlsford estate in Kent, that sprawling property of pale stone and manicured gardens that had been the seat of the Greymont family for 10 generations. Emma accompanied them at Theodore's insistence, and William's desperate clinging. The boy would not allow her out of his sight for more than a few minutes at a time, his small hand constantly reaching for hers as though she were a lifeline in turbulent waters. Theodore understood this dependence intellectually, but Emma could see the flash of hurt in his blue eyes each time William chose her comfort over his father's. The Duke had dreamed of reuniting with his son for 5 years, but the reality was far more complicated than his grief-stricken imagination had allowed. The journey from London took most of a day, and William spent it pressed against the carriage window, watching the countryside pass with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail. When Carlsford Manor finally came into view, rising from its perfectly maintained grounds like something from a fairy tale, the boy's breath caught audibly. "Is this truly where I was born?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Theodore replied from his seat across the carriage. "Your mother loved this house. She spent hours in the gardens, particularly the rose garden behind the east wing. She said the scent of roses in summer was the most beautiful thing in England." William absorbed this information with the solemn attention he gave to everything concerning his lost mother. "I wish I could remember her." "I shall tell you about her," Theodore promised. "Every day if you wish, so that you know the remarkable woman who gave you life." The household staff had assembled in the entrance hall to greet their new young master, a sea of curious and sympathetic faces. Mrs. Wesley, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 30 years, wept openly when she saw William. She had been present the night of his birth, and had mourned what she believed was his death. "The very image of his grace as a boy," she said, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. Oh, what Charlotte would give to see this day. Theodore had assigned William the nursery suite that had been prepared 5 years ago and left untouched since the tragedy. Emma accompanied the boy upstairs, holding his hand as they entered rooms decorated in soft blues and creams, filled with toys that had never been played with and books that had never been read. A magnificent wooden rocking horse stood near the window, its painted eyes seeming to watch their entrance. William approached the horse slowly, reaching out to touch its carved mane with tentative fingers. "Is this mine?" "Everything in these rooms is yours," Emma assured him. "Your father had them prepared before you were born. He wanted you to have the finest of everything." The boy climbed onto the horse and began to rock gently, his expression transforming from wariness to wonder. For the first time since Emma had found him in Whitford Bay, William smiled with genuine joy, and the sight brought tears to her eyes. Theodore stood in the doorway, watching his son discover the childhood that should have been his from the beginning. When William noticed his presence, the boy's smile faltered, uncertainty creeping back into his features. Emma recognized the problem immediately. William had learned to fear authority figures, to associate men in positions of power with harsh treatment and casual cruelty. Thomas Brenwick had not been physically abusive, but his indifference and occasional anger had taught the boy that survival meant making himself small and unobtrusive. "Your Grace," Emma said gently, "perhaps you might show William the stables. I noticed his interest in horses during our journey." Theodore seized the suggestion with visible relief. "Would you like to see the horses, William? We have some of the finest bloodstock in England. Your grandfather bred them, and I have continued his work." William looked to Emma for permission, and she nodded encouragingly. "Go on. I shall be here when you return." The boy climbed down from the rocking horse and approached his father with cautious steps. Theodore extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, William took it. Emma watched them depart together, the tall Duke adjusting his stride to match his small son's steps, and she allowed herself to hope that healing might be possible despite the years of separation. Dr. Pemberton arrived the following morning to conduct a thorough examination of William's health. The physician had brought specialized equipment from London and spent 2 hours documenting every aspect of the boy's physical condition. Emma remained present throughout, as William refused to be examined without her nearby. The doctor's conclusions were sobering, but not unexpected. William was significantly underweight for his age, his growth stunted by years of inadequate nutrition. He showed signs of past injuries that had healed poorly, including a badly set fracture in his left wrist that had left the joint with limited mobility. His teeth required immediate attention from a dentist, and he had the persistent cough of a child who had spent too many cold nights in inadequate shelter. Physically, he will recover with proper care, nutrition, and time, Dr. Pemberton reported to Theodore in the library that evening. He is fundamentally healthy, and children are remarkably resilient. But the emotional damage concerns me more deeply, Your Grace. He has been trained to expect punishment and neglect. Trust will be difficult for him to rebuild. What do you recommend? Theodore asked. And Emma heard the helplessness in his voice that no amount of wealth or title could alleviate. Patience, Dr. Pemberton replied simply. Consistency. Allow him to approach you at his own pace, rather than overwhelming him with affection he does not yet understand. And keep Miss Hathaway close. She is his anchor at present. He trusts her absolutely, and through her he may learn to trust others. So Emma remained at Carlsford Manor, installed in rooms adjacent to William's nursery suite. Theodore insisted she accept clothing appropriate to her station as the daughter of a viscount, rather than the worn garments of a struggling seamstress. He arranged for a lady's maid, increased servants to attend her needs, and made it clear to the household that Miss Hathaway was to be treated with the respect due to an honoured guest, rather than a hired employee. The days settled into a careful routine. Emma woke each morning to find William already awake, standing at her door waiting for her emergence. They breakfasted together in the nursery, then spent the morning hours in gentle activities designed to help the boy recover his strength. Emma read to him from the children's books that lined the nursery shelves, teaching him letters and numbers that his years of servitude had denied him. His intelligence was unmistakable. He absorbed information with startling speed, asking questions that revealed a mind hungry for knowledge and understanding. Theodore joined them each afternoon, arriving with the tentative air of a man entering foreign territory. He brought gifts, carefully chosen items designed to appeal to a 5-year-old boy, toy soldiers, picture books, a miniature carriage pulled by wooden horses. William accepted each offering with polite gratitude, but without the enthusiasm Theodore clearly hoped for. The distance between father and son remained stubbornly persistent, a chasm 5 years wide that could not be bridged in days or even weeks. Emma watched Theodore's growing frustration with sympathy. He had imagined that love alone would be sufficient, that the bond of blood would transcend the years of separation. But William had no memory of his father, no instinctive recognition of kinship. To the boy, Theodore was simply another powerful man, whose moods must be carefully monitored and whose expectations must be met to ensure safety. He fears me, Theodore said to Emma one evening after William had been put to bed. They stood in the corridor outside the nursery, and the Duke's voice carried defeat Emma had never heard from him. My own son fears me. He fears what men in authority have represented to him, Emma corrected gently. Mr. Brenwick taught him that his value lay only in his usefulness, that mistakes brought punishment, and that affection was not something he deserved. You must show him through actions, not words, that you are different. How? Theodore asked, and the vulnerability in that single word revealed the depth of his desperation. Be present, Emma advised. Not with gifts or grand gestures, but with your time and attention. Sit with him during meals. Listen when he speaks, even if his words seem insignificant. Show interest in his thoughts and feelings. Prove through consistency that you will not abandon him or hurt him, no matter what. Theodore took her advice to heart. He began joining Emma and William for breakfast each morning, arriving in shirt sleeves rather than formal attire, making himself less intimidating through deliberate casualness. He asked William about the books Emma read to him, about which toy soldiers were his favourites, about whether he preferred strawberry jam or honey on his toast. Small questions that required small answers, building gradually toward genuine conversation. The breakthrough came in late June, nearly 6 weeks after William's arrival at Carlsford Manor. Theodore had taken the boy to the stables, as had become their afternoon custom, and Emma watched from the window as father and son observed the grooms exercising the horses in the paddock. A young mare was being led through her paces, and William's attention fixed on the animal with his characteristic intensity. Emma could not hear the conversation from her vantage point, but she saw Theodore kneel beside William, pointing out aspects of the mare's conformation and movement. The Duke's expertise in horseflesh was considerable, inherited from his father and refined through years of careful breeding. And apparently William had asked a question that sparked genuine enthusiasm. Theodore spoke at length, gesturing to illustrate his points, and William listened with rapt attention. Then, for the first time since returning to Carlsford Manor, William laughed. Not the polite sound of a child performing expected behaviour, but genuine, delighted laughter at something Theodore had said. The Duke's face transformed with joy so profound it was almost painful to witness, and when William spontaneously grabbed his father's hand to pull him closer to the paddock fence, Theodore looked as though he had been granted the greatest gift imaginable. From that day forward, the relationship between father and son began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. William still sought Emma's presence and comfort, but he also began seeking Theodore's company, particularly for matters relating to horses and the management of the estate. The Duke proved to be a patient teacher, explaining complex concepts in terms a 5-year-old could understand, never showing frustration when William's attention wandered or when he needed explanations repeated. Emma found herself with increasing amounts of free time as William grew more comfortable with his father. She used those hours to reacquaint herself with the rhythms of aristocratic life she had abandoned 5 years ago. She walked the gardens, read in the library, and occasionally received visits from Mrs. Wesley, who was eager to share memories of Charlotte and express gratitude for William's return. "You saved him," the housekeeper said one afternoon as they took tea in Emma's sitting room. "When the rest of us believed him dead and gone, you fought to bring him home. The family owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "I did only what should have been done from the beginning," Emma replied, uncomfortable with praise for actions she considered her basic duty. Meanwhile, London society churned with scandal over the dramatic interruption of the Duke of Carlsford's wedding. The newspapers had seized upon the story with relish, publishing breathless accounts that grew more sensational with each retelling. Marguerite Whitford's crimes were exposed for all to examine, and the Tun spoke of little else at their dinners and assemblies. Theodore received hundreds of letters, some offering congratulations on his son's return, others seeking confirmation of the scandalous details, and still others proposing various business arrangements or marriage alliances, now that he was once again an eligible widower. He ignored most of the correspondence, delegating responses to his secretary while he focused entirely on William. The legal process of legitimizing William's return proved more complex than Theodore had anticipated. Though Dr. Pemberton's examination confirmed the boy's identity, and though the birthmark was indisputable evidence of his lineage, the fact remained that William had been legally declared dead 5 years ago. That declaration had to be formally reversed, requiring testimony from multiple witnesses and submission of evidence to various official bodies. Mr. Whitmore worked tirelessly on the matter, filing petitions and arranging hearings, but the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. "It will be resolved," the solicitor assured Theodore in mid-July. "The evidence is overwhelming, and no one seriously disputes the boy's identity. But the process must follow proper channels. By autumn, I expect William will be formally recognized as your legitimate heir, with all rights and privileges restored." Theodore accepted this timeline with poorly concealed impatience, but there was little he could do to expedite matters. In the meantime, he threw himself into making up for lost time with his son, and Emma observed the transformation in both of them with quiet satisfaction. One evening in late July, after William had been put to bed, Theodore sought Emma out in the library where she had been reading. He carried 2 glasses of wine and offered one to her with a slight smile. "I realized I have never properly thanked you," he said, taking the seat across from hers, "for everything you have done, for seeing what no one else saw, for risking your reputation and safety to save William, for staying when you had every right to leave us to sort through this mess on our own." Emma accepted the wine but did not drink immediately. "Your Grace, you have thanked me repeatedly. You have restored my reputation, provided financial compensation far beyond what I deserved, and given me a place in your household. There is nothing more required." "There is everything more required," Theodore countered. "Emma, may I call you Emma? Miss Hathaway seems insufferably formal given what we have been through together." "Of course, Your Grace. And you must call me Theodore, at least when we are private." He sipped his wine, his gaze thoughtful. "I have been observing you these past weeks. The way you are with William, patient when he is difficult, firm when he needs boundaries, gentle always, but never condescending. You treat him as a person deserving of respect rather than a problem to be managed." "He is deserving of respect," Emma said simply. All children are, though few adults remember to offer it. You would have been a remarkable mother, Theodore said quietly. Charlotte would have liked you immensely. She had that same quality, that ability to see the person beneath the circumstances and respond to genuine need rather than surface behavior. Emma's throat tightened at the mention of Charlotte. I wish I could have saved her, Your Grace. Theodore, that failure will haunt me always. You did everything possible, Theodore said firmly. Dr. Pemberton confirmed it. The hemorrhaging was catastrophic and beyond any midwife's ability to control. Charlotte's death was tragedy, not negligence, despite what I said in my grief and anger 5 years ago. He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. I was wrong to blame you. Wrong to allow Marguerite to use you as a scapegoat. Wrong to dismiss you without investigating the circumstances more thoroughly. I let my pain blind me to truth and justice, and you paid the price for my failure. You were grieving, Emma said gently. Grief makes us irrational. I do not blame you for believing what you were told, when you had no reason to suspect deception. You are far more forgiving than I deserve. Theodore rose and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. These past weeks, watching you with William, I have realized something. You are not just his savior or his comfort. You have become essential to both of us. He loves you, Emma. And I... He paused, seeming to search for words. I find myself grateful every day that you are here. Not merely for William's sake, but for my own. Emma's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice carefully neutral. I am glad I can be of service, Your Grace. Theodore. He turned back to face her, and something in his expression made Emma's breath catch. Service is not what I mean, though I am expressing myself poorly, as I seem to do whenever emotions are involved. He returned to his seat and set down his wineglass with careful precision. Emma, would you consider remaining at Carlsford Manor permanently, not as William's companion or as an honoured guest, but as part of our family? Emma stared at him, uncertain she had understood correctly. Your Grace, I am asking you to consider becoming my wife, Theodore said, the words emerging in a rush as though he feared losing courage if he spoke slowly. Not immediately. God knows both William and I need time to heal from what has been done to us. But eventually, when the scandal has died down, and when you have had opportunity to know us better, I would be honoured if you would consent to be my wife and William's mother in truth, rather than merely in practice. Emma's mind reeled. She had not expected this, had not allowed herself to even imagine such a possibility. Theodore was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England. She was the disgraced daughter of a minor viscount, a woman whose reputation had only recently been restored. The match was absurd by society standards. Yet the sincerity in Theodore's eyes was unmistakable. This is unexpected, she managed finally. I know, Theodore said quickly, and I am not asking for an answer now, only for you to consider the possibility, to allow me the opportunity to court you properly, to prove that my regard is genuine and not merely gratitude for William's return. Emma thought of William, asleep upstairs in rooms she had helped transform from a shrine to a lost child into a living boys' sanctuary. She thought of the past weeks, watching father and son slowly find their way toward each other. She thought of Theodore's patience, his gentleness with William, despite his own pain, his willingness to learn and adapt for his son's sake. I will consider it, she said finally. But Theodore, you must understand, I will not marry for gratitude or duty. If I accept your suit, it will be because I believe we can build something real, something based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I would expect nothing less, Theodore replied, and his smile was the first truly unguarded expression Emma had seen from him since Charlotte's death. Take all the time you need. I shall endeavour to prove myself worthy of your consideration. As Emma retired to her chambers that night, her mind whirled with possibilities she had never dared imagine. The future remained uncertain, filled with questions about propriety and society's judgment. But for the first time in 5 years, Emma allowed herself to hope that happiness might be possible, not just for the child she had saved, but for herself as well. The trial of Marguerite Whitford began on the 15th of September, 1823, in the Court of King's Bench in London. The proceeding attracted unprecedented public attention, with crowds gathering outside the courthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman whose crimes had scandalized the nation. Newspapers devoted entire pages to speculation about the case, and broadsheets sold illustrations depicting Marguerite in various stages of villainy, from stealing the infant heir to purchasing poison from sinister chemists. Emma did not attend the trial. Theodore had offered to arrange for her presence if she wished to witness Marguerite's judgment, but Emma declined. She had no desire to see the woman again, no need to hear the details of crimes she already understood too well. Instead, she remained at Carlsford Manor with William, who had begun to thrive in the security of his restored home, but still suffered nightmares about being taken away again. Theodore travelled to London for the duration of the trial, accompanied by Mr. Whitmore and Dr. Pemberton, both of whom would provide crucial testimony. He sent daily letters to Emma, detailed accounts of the proceedings that she read aloud to William in carefully edited versions that spared the boy the worst details of Marguerite's malice. The evidence against Marguerite was overwhelming. Mr. Whitmore presented Brenwick's receipts and the letter bearing her initials. Dr. Pemberton testified about the arsenic poisoning and the suspicious disappearance of the stillborn infant from the London residence. Mrs. Alice Fletcher provided her account of that terrible night, her voice steady as she described how the body she had prepared for burial had vanished under Marguerite's orders. Even Thomas Brenwick himself testified, having agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. But it was Theodore's testimony that proved most damning. He stood before the court and described 5 years of manipulation, of Marguerite inserting herself into every aspect of his life while he grieved. He spoke of her control over his household, her dismissal of servants who might have questioned her authority, her careful cultivation of his dependence on her organizational skills and emotional support. He detailed the stomach pains and weakness he had experienced in recent weeks, symptoms that had ceased entirely, once Marguerite's arrest removed her access to his food and drink. The defense attempted to portray Marguerite as a victim of her circumstances, driven to desperate measures by poverty and society's refusal to acknowledge her noble blood. Her barrister argued that the theft of the child had been motivated by misguided mercy rather than malice, that she had genuinely believed William would die without intervention and had sought to spare Theodore additional pain. The prosecution demolished this argument with ruthless efficiency. If Marguerite had acted from mercy, why had she sold the child to a merchant rather than placing him with a loving family? If she had truly cared for Theodore's well-being, why had she purchased poison clearly intended for his murder? The evidence of premeditation was incontrovertible, documented in her own hand through correspondence with the intermediary who had facilitated William's sale and receipts from the chemist who had sold her the arsenic. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for harsh sentences in cases involving crimes against nobility, pronounced judgment with evident satisfaction. Marguerite Whitford was sentenced to life imprisonment in Newgate Prison, to be held in solitary confinement, given the calculated nature of her crimes and the danger she posed to society. The courtroom erupted in applause when the sentence was announced, a breach of decorum that the judge did not bother to suppress. Marguerite stood in the dock with her face blank, all emotion seemingly drained from her features. As guards led her away, she looked directly at Theodore one final time, and whatever she saw in his expression made her flinch as though struck. Thomas Brenwick received 10 years' imprisonment for his role in the conspiracy, a sentence Theodore had specifically requested as sufficient to punish the crime without destroying the man entirely. The merchant had cooperated fully once confronted with evidence of his wrongdoing, and his testimony had been crucial in establishing the timeline of William's abduction. News of the sensational proceedings did not remain confined to London. Within a fortnight, even the distant lanes of Whitford Bay were humming with talk of the disgraced Duchess, the stolen heir, and the midwife whose name had at last been cleared. Theodore returned to Carlsford Manor 3 days after the trial concluded. his face showing the strain of reliving the trauma of 5 years ago. William ran to greet him when his carriage arrived, the boy's natural reserve finally crumbling under weeks of growing trust and affection. Theodore swept his son into his arms and held him for a long moment, and Emma saw tears tracking down the Duke's face, though he made no sound. The revelations that emerged during the trial continued to shock even those who thought they understood the scope of Marguerite's crimes. Court documents revealed that she had systematically embezzled funds from the Carlsford estate accounts over 5 years, small amounts that individually went unnoticed, but collectively totaled nearly £3,000. She had maintained a network of bribed servants who reported Theodore's movements and conversations, ensuring she always possessed information that allowed her to position herself as indispensable. Most chillingly, investigators found letters in her possession outlining plans to eliminate Theodore's younger sister, Lady Catherine, should she raise questions about the marriage or inheritance arrangements. Lady Catherine herself arrived at Carlsford Manor in late September, having read the newspaper accounts with growing horror. She was a woman of 28, with Theodore's black hair and their mother's green eyes, and she embraced her brother with fierce protectiveness before kneeling to meet her nephew for the first time. William, shy with strangers, despite his growing confidence, accepted her gentle greeting with cautious politeness. But when Lady Catherine presented him with a gift, a leather-bound book of fairy tales that had belonged to Theodore as a child, the boy's reserve melted slightly. He thanked his aunt with careful courtesy, and Emma saw Theodore's expression soften with pride at his son's improving manners. The autumn months passed in a rhythm of gradual healing. William grew stronger each day, his thin frame filling out with proper nutrition and his persistent cough finally subsiding under Dr. Pemberton's treatment. His education advanced rapidly under the tutor Theodore hired, a gentle scholar who recognized the boy's quick intelligence and fed it with appropriate challenges. William learned to read with a speed that astonished everyone, devouring books from the nursery library and asking endless questions about everything from astronomy to agriculture. His relationship with Theodore deepened in ways both obvious and subtle. The wariness that had characterized their early interactions disappeared as William learned through consistent experience that his father would not abandon him, would not punish him for small mistakes, would not withdraw affection capriciously. By early October, 3 months after his return to Carlsford Manor, William called Theodore father without prompting. For the first time, the word emerging naturally during a conversation about the horses, rather than as a formal acknowledgement of status. Theodore had frozen when he heard it, his blue eyes filling with tears he did not attempt to hide. He had knelt and pulled William into an embrace that the boy returned with equal fervour, and Emma, watching from across the stable yard, felt her own throat tighten with emotion. But even as father and son grew closer, Emma began to feel the particular melancholy that comes from recognizing that one's purpose has been fulfilled. William no longer needed her constant presence. He sought her out still, enjoyed her company, and valued her counsel. But his primary attachment had shifted appropriately to Theodore. The Duke had proven himself worthy of his son's trust, and William now turned to his father first for comfort, guidance, and companionship. Emma understood that this was exactly as it should be. She had been William's anchor during the frightening transition from servitude to privilege, the familiar face in a world of strangers and overwhelming change. But she had always been meant to be temporary, a bridge between the boy's stolen past and his rightful future. That bridge had served its purpose. Now it was time for her to step back and allow the Greymont family to become whole without her. Whatever ache the prospect left in her chest, she refused to cling to any claim that might one day make William feel torn between the two people he loved most. She began making quiet preparations to depart Carlsford Manor. She wrote to Mrs. Fletcher in London, inquiring about positions for midwives or companions that might provide respectable employment. She carefully packed the few belongings she had brought with her and the modest gifts Theodore had given her during her months in residence. She planned to leave in early November, timing her departure to minimize disruption to William's routine. The boy would be saddened, certainly, but with Theodore's steady presence and the security of his restored identity, Emma believed William would adjust quickly. She had not anticipated how difficult she would find leaving. Not just because of William, though saying goodbye to the child she had saved and nurtured would tear her heart, but because of Theodore himself. During the months at Carlsford Manor, she had come to know the Duke not as the grief-stricken, desperate man he had been at his interrupted wedding, but as he truly was beneath the tragedy that had defined his recent years. Theodore was intelligent without arrogance, wielding his considerable education and natural insight with humour rather than condescension. He was kind to his servants, fair with his tenants, and devoted to the improvement of his properties in ways that benefited everyone who depended on the estate. He read voraciously, could discuss subjects from philosophy to farming with equal facility, and possessed a dry wit that emerged when he felt comfortable enough to let his guard down. Most importantly, he was an excellent father once he understood what William needed. He had set aside his initial expectations of instant connection and allowed the relationship to develop at the boy's pace. He celebrated small victories, like William's first genuine laugh or his willingness to ride alone on a pony, with unfeigned joy. He provided structure and discipline without harshness, and he showered his son with affection that never felt performative or overwhelming. Emma found herself thinking about Theodore far more than was appropriate for a guest in his household. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when William made him laugh. She appreciated the careful attention he gave to her opinions during their evening conversations. She caught herself watching him interact with his son and feeling something warm and dangerous unfurl in her chest. This was precisely why she needed to leave, Emma told herself firmly. Theodore had made his proposal in July, asking her to consider becoming his wife. But that offer had been made during the immediate aftermath of William's rescue. 3 months had passed. Theodore had never mentioned the subject again, and Emma interpreted his silence as evidence that the proposal had been motivated by gratitude and relief rather than genuine affection. He had his son back. His life was returning to normal. He no longer needed the disgraced midwife who had interrupted his wedding. She chose a morning in late October to inform Theodore of her intention to depart. She found him in his study, reviewing accounts with his steward, and waited until the meeting concluded, before requesting a private word. Theodore dismissed the steward with a nod and gestured for Emma to sit, his expression curious but not concerned. Emma remained standing. If she sat, she might lose her courage. "Your Grace," she began, deliberately using his formal title to establish appropriate distance. "I believe the time has come for me to take my leave of Carlsford Manor. William has adjusted admirably to his new life. He no longer requires my constant presence, and my continued residence serves no practical purpose." Theodore stared at her, as though she had announced her intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. The colour drained from his face, and he gripped the edge of his desk with enough force that his knuckles went white. "You wish to leave?" he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I believe it best," Emma replied, keeping her own voice steady with effort. "William needs to bond fully with you without my interference. My presence has become an unnecessary complication." "Unnecessary," Theodore repeated, and something in his tone made Emma look at him more closely. He had risen from his chair and stood rigid with tension, his blue eyes blazing with emotion she could not quite identify. "You believe your presence here is unnecessary? William no longer needs me as he did," Emma said. "You have become the father he deserves. My work here is complete." "Your work," Theodore said, and now Emma heard anger beneath the shock. "Is that what these past months have been to you? Work to be completed and then abandoned once the task is finished?" Emma faltered, uncertain how to respond to his intensity. "Your Grace, I do not understand why you are upset. Surely you anticipated that I would eventually depart. I cannot remain at Carlsford Manor indefinitely." "Why not?" Theodore demanded. "I asked you to stay. I asked you to consider becoming my wife. Did you think I spoke in jest? That my proposal was merely politeness? You have not mentioned it again in 3 months," Emma pointed out. "I assumed you had reconsidered, that the offer was made in the emotion of the moment, and that calmer reflection revealed its impracticality." Theodore closed the distance between them in 3 strides, stopping close enough that Emma had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. When he spoke, his voice was low and intense. I did not mention it again because I was giving you time. Time to know me and William. Time to be certain of your feelings without pressure or obligation. I thought I was being respectful of your independence, allowing you to make a choice free from the gratitude and chaos of William's immediate rescue. Emma's heart began to beat faster. Theodore, do you truly believe I do not need you? He continued. That William is the only reason I want you to stay. Emma, these past months have shown me what my life could be. Should be. I watch you with my son, and I see the mother he deserves. I speak with you in the evenings, and I find intellectual companionship I had despaired of ever experiencing again. I observe your kindness to my servants, your interest in estate matters, your ability to find joy in simple things despite everything you have endured. And I realize that somewhere between the chapel and this moment, I have fallen in love with you. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. You cannot mean that. I have never been more serious about anything in my life, Theodore said. If you leave Carlsford Manor, you will take with you not just William's beloved guardian, but my only hope for genuine happiness. I am asking you, Emma, not as a duke to a subject, but as a man to a woman he loves desperately. Please do not leave us. Please consider that what I offer is not gratitude or duty, but real and abiding love that will last as long as I draw breath. Emma stared at him, seeing the naked vulnerability in his expression, the fear that she would refuse him and walk away. She thought of the months they had spent together, the gradual deepening of affection she had tried so hard to deny. She thought of William, who needed both of them, and she thought of the future stretching ahead, empty and lonely if she left, or full and bright if she had the courage to stay. I love you too, she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. I have been trying not to, but I cannot seem to help myself. Theodore's expression transformed with joy so profound it was almost painful to witness. He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly, as though afraid she might vanish. Then stay, he said. Marry me. Be William's mother and my wife. Let us build the life we all deserve. Emma looked into his blue eyes and saw her future reflected there, uncertain in its details, but absolutely certain in its foundation of love and commitment. She thought of all the reasons society would condemn their union, the scandal that would follow a duke marrying a disgraced midwife. Then she thought of William's laughter, of Theodore's gentle strength, of the possibility of building something real and lasting. Yes, she said, I will marry you. Theodore pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left them both breathless, and Emma surrendered to the knowledge that she had finally found where she belonged. The gardens of Carlsford Manor had been transformed by early winter frost, the bare branches of trees etched against pale November skies like delicate pen drawings. Emma walked beside Theodore along the gravel paths, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, marveling at how natural the gesture had become in the days since accepting his proposal. William ran ahead of them, chasing fallen leaves that swirled in the cold breeze, his laughter carrying back to where the adults followed at a more sedate pace. We should tell him soon, Emma said, watching the boy dart between hedgerows with the boundless energy of a healthy 5-year-old. Before the household staff hear rumours and mention it in his presence. Theodore nodded, his expression thoughtful. Tonight, perhaps, after dinner. We can explain it together. Make certain he understands that your marriage to me will not diminish your affection for him, but rather formalize what already exists in practice. Emma felt a flutter of nervousness. What if he objects? What if he fears that I will become more interested in being your wife than in being his guardian? Then we will reassure him until he believes us, Theodore replied with the calm certainty that Emma had come to associate with his approach to fatherhood. William has learned to trust us these past months. He will not abandon that trust easily, even when faced with change. That evening, they gathered William in the small sitting room adjacent to the nursery, the same room where Emma had spent countless hours reading to the boy during his early weeks at Carlsford Manor. Theodore sat in one chair, Emma in another, and William settled on the carpet between them with his wooden horse, sensing the seriousness of the occasion, even if he did not yet understand its nature. William, Theodore began, his voice gentle, Miss Hathaway and I have something important to tell you. something that will affect all three of us." The boy looked up with immediate wariness, his blue eyes moving between the adults. "Is someone taking me away again?" "No," Emma said quickly, leaning forward to take his small hand. "Nothing like that could ever happen. You are exactly where you belong, and no one will ever separate you from your father." William relaxed slightly but remained watchful. "Then what?" Theodore chose his words carefully. "You know that Miss Hathaway has been living here at Carlsford Manor because you needed her help adjusting to your new life. But now that you have grown more comfortable, she was considering leaving us to return to her own life elsewhere." William's face crumpled with distress. "No, she cannot leave. I need her here." "That is what I told her," Theodore said, a small smile touching his lips, "which is why I asked her to stay permanently, not just as your guardian and companion, but as my wife, as your mother, if you will accept her in that role." The boy stared at them, processing this information with visible concentration. "You want to marry Miss Hathaway?" "Very much," Theodore confirmed, "but only if you are comfortable with the arrangement. You are my son, William. Your happiness and well-being are my primary concerns. If this marriage would distress you in any way, I will not pursue it." William looked at Emma with an intensity that reminded her powerfully of Theodore. "Will you still read to me if you marry father? Will you still help me with my letters and listen when I want to talk about horses?" "Of course," Emma assured him. "Those things will not change. The only difference is that I will be your mother in truth as well as in affection, and I will have the legal right to protect you and make decisions about your care alongside your father. And you will not leave," William pressed. "Even when I am older and do not need help anymore. I will never leave," Emma promised. "This will be my home as much as it is yours. We will be a family, the three of us together." William considered this for a long moment, his expression solemn. Then, with the directness of childhood, he asked the question that mattered most to him. "Will you be happy?" The simple inquiry carried such concern, such desire to ensure the well-being of the adults who had become his anchors, that Emma felt tears prick her eyes. This child, who had every reason to be selfish after years of neglect and deprivation, worried about whether his father and guardian would find happiness in their union. "Very happy," Emma told him honestly. "I love your father, William, and I love you. Being part of this family would bring me more joy than I ever imagined possible." William nodded slowly, then rose from the carpet and approached Theodore's chair. "Father, may I tell you something?" "Always," Theodore said, pulling his son onto his lap. William wrapped his arms around Theodore's neck and whispered something Emma could not hear. Whatever the boy said made Theodore's eyes fill with tears, and he embraced William with fierce tenderness before looking up at Emma with an expression of such profound emotion that she felt her own tears fall. "William says," Theodore reported, his voice thick, "that he is glad I am marrying you because you make me smile the way I did before, when his real mother was alive. He says Charlotte would have liked you." Emma rose and joined them, kneeling beside the chair so she could embrace both father and son. "Thank you, William. That is the greatest compliment I could ever receive." The boy pulled back slightly to look at her with those startling blue eyes. "May I call you mother? Or would you prefer Miss Hathaway still?" "You may call me whatever feels comfortable," Emma said gently. "There is no requirement. Take your time and decide what feels right." William nodded thoughtfully, and Emma suspected he would need weeks or even months to settle on the right form of address. But that evening, when she tucked him into bed and kissed his forehead good night, he whispered, "Thank you, Mother," in a voice so soft she might have imagined it. Emma left the nursery with her heart full to bursting, understanding that healing was not a destination, but a journey they were all travelling together. The engagement was announced officially in December, and London society erupted in scandal for the second time that year regarding the Duke of Carlsford. That he should marry the disgraced midwife who had interrupted his previous wedding was shocking enough. That he should elevate a woman of relatively humble origins to the position of Duchess violated every expectation of aristocratic behaviour. The newspapers published editorials questioning Theodore's judgment. Matrons at fashionable assemblies declared they would refuse to receive the new Duchess. Several of Theodore's distant relatives wrote letters expressing dismay at his choice. Theodore ignored all of it with a serenity that surprised even those who knew him well. When Lord Hartwick visited Carlsford Manor in January to deliver yet another missive from concerned family members, Theodore barely glanced at the letter before tossing it into the fire. "They may think what they wish," he said calmly. "I am marrying the woman I love, who saved my son and restored my life. Society's approval is irrelevant. The Prince Regent himself has expressed reservations," Lord Hartwick felt obligated to mention. "Then the Prince Regent may decline his invitation to the wedding," Theodore replied without concern. "Emma and I are marrying regardless of who approves or disapproves." The wedding took place on the 14th of February, 1824, in the same private chapel where Emma had interrupted Theodore's marriage to Marguerite just 9 months earlier. But where that ceremony had been grand and crowded, this one was intimate and joyful. Only close family and trusted friends attended, perhaps 30 people in total, and the atmosphere was one of genuine celebration rather than social obligation. Emma wore a gown of pale gold silk, simpler than Marguerite's elaborate white creation, but infinitely more beautiful for its elegant restraint. Theodore had given her his mother's pearls to wear, and Lady Catherine had arranged Emma's brown hair in a style that was both fashionable and flattering. When Emma walked down the aisle on the arm of Dr. Pemberton, who had agreed to stand in place of her late father, she saw Theodore waiting at the altar with an expression of such love and anticipation that she had to blink back tears. William stood beside his father, dressed in miniature formal attire and holding the ring cushion with fierce concentration. He had practiced his role for days, determined to execute his duties perfectly. And when the moment came to present the rings, he performed flawlessly. Theodore ruffled his son's hair affectionately before turning his full attention to Emma, and the vows they spoke were infused with meaning that transcended the traditional words. "I, Theodore Charles William Greymont, take thee, Emma Catherine Hathaway, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Emma repeated the vows with a steady voice, looking into Theodore's blue eyes and seeing their future reflected there. When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, and Theodore kissed her before the assembled witnesses, she felt as though every difficult experience of the past 5 years had led to this moment of perfect rightness. The wedding breakfast was held at Carlsford Manor, a modest affair by aristocratic standards, but more than sufficient for the intimate gathering. William stayed close to Emma throughout the celebration, occasionally touching her dress as though to reassure himself of her continued presence. Several guests commented on the obvious affection between the new Duchess and her stepson, and Emma heard more than one whispered prediction that society's initial censure would fade once people witnessed the genuine happiness of the Greymont family. Theodore and Emma spent their wedding night at Carlsford Manor rather than travelling for a formal honeymoon. William was not yet secure enough to manage separation from both his primary caregivers, and Emma felt no disappointment at remaining close to the boy who had become her son in all but blood. There would be time for travel later, when William's fears had fully subsided and when the three of them could journey together as a family. The months that followed the wedding settled into a rhythm of domestic contentment that Emma had never dared imagine for herself. She took on the responsibilities of running Carlsford Manor with efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Wesley, who had served 3 duchesses before her. Emma modernized the household accounts, improved conditions for the servants, and established a small school on the estate grounds where the children of tenants could receive basic education. Theodore supported all her initiatives with enthusiasm, and together they created an environment where their household staff worked with loyalty, born of genuine respect rather than fear of punishment. William thrived under the security of having 2 parents who adored him. His education advanced rapidly, and by his 6th birthday in November of 1824, he read at a level far beyond his years and had developed a passion for mathematics that surprised his tutors. His relationship with Theodore deepened daily, the early wariness completely replaced by the easy affection of a boy who knew himself unconditionally loved. And with Emma, he displayed a tenderness that melted her heart, bringing her small gifts he found during his explorations of the estate and seeking her counsel on matters both trivial and significant. In December of 1825, Emma gave birth to twin sons. The labour was long but uncomplicated, and Dr. Pemberton pronounced both mother and infants in excellent health. Theodore wept openly when he held his newborn sons for the first time, and William, now 7 years old, approached his infant brothers with a mixture of awe and protective concern that suggested he would take his role as eldest sibling very seriously. The twins were christened Charles and Edward, traditional Greymont family names, and they grew into boisterous, healthy babies who filled Carlsford Manor with noise and chaos and immeasurable joy. Emma discovered that mothering infants while managing a ducal household required skills she had not fully appreciated. But Theodore proved to be an involved and supportive father who had no qualms about changing nappies or walking the floor with a crying baby at 2 a.m. The years passed with the peculiar speed of happy times. William's nightmares about being taken away gradually ceased, replaced by dreams of horses and adventures appropriate to a growing boy. His love for his brothers was evident in the gentle way he played with them, carefully adjusting his strength and energy to match their smaller size. By the time he turned 8, he had begun accompanying Theodore on rounds of the estate, learning the responsibilities of a future duke with the same intensity he brought to all his interests. Society, which had initially condemned Theodore's choice of bride, gradually came to accept and even admire the new Duchess of Carlsford. Emma's intelligence, grace, and obvious devotion to her family won over even the most sceptical matrons. The school she established on the estate became a model that other progressive landowners sought to emulate. Her charitable work supporting midwives and women in difficult circumstances earned praise from quarters that had once refused to acknowledge her existence. The scandal of Marguerite Whitford's crimes faded into history, mentioned only occasionally when someone recalled the dramatic wedding interruption that had saved both the Duke and his stolen heir. Marguerite herself languished in Newgate prison, reportedly having gone completely mad within 2 years of her imprisonment, her grand ambitions reduced to incoherent ravings in a cold cell. In the spring of 1828, Emma stood at the window of Carlsford Manor's drawing room, watching her family in the gardens below. William, now 10 years old, rode his favourite horse through the paddock, demonstrating proper jumping technique for his younger brothers. Charles and Edward, just past their 3rd birthday, sat on the fence with Theodore behind them, his arms wrapped protectively around his youngest sons as they watched their eldest brother with rapt attention and enthusiastic cheers. William cleared the jump flawlessly, and the twins applauded with uncoordinated exuberance that made Theodore laugh. Emma saw her husband ruffle the boy's hair and say something that made all 3 of them turn to look up at the house, searching for her. She raised her hand in a wave, and William waved back before guiding his horse toward the fence so his brothers could pet the animal's velvet nose. Lady Catherine appeared at Emma's elbow, following her gaze to the scene below. "You have built something remarkable here," Theodore's sister observed, "not just in restoring William to his rightful place, but in creating a family filled with genuine love and happiness. Charlotte would have been so grateful to know her son was raised by someone who treasures him as you do." "I am the fortunate one," Emma replied honestly. 5 years ago, I lived in exile, disgraced and alone, believing I had lost everything. Now I have a husband I love beyond measure, 3 sons who fill my days with purpose and joy, and a place in the world I never thought to claim. If someone had told me then that interrupting a wedding would lead to all of this, I would have thought them mad. "You saved more than William that day," Lady Catherine said. "You saved Theodore from a terrible fate and gave him back his capacity for happiness. You saved yourself from permanent exile and found the family you deserved. And you saved all of us who love them both from losing them to Marguerite's schemes." Emma watched Theodore lift Edward down from the fence while Charles climbed onto his father's shoulders, demanding to be carried to the stables. William dismounted and took Edward's hand, and the 4 of them began walking toward the house together, a portrait of masculine contentment across 3 generations. "I sometimes think about that moment in the chapel," Emma admitted. How terrified I was to speak up. How certain I felt that no one would believe me. If I had lost courage, if I had walked away rather than interrupting the ceremony, none of this would exist. But you did speak, Lady Catherine reminded her. You stood before a chapel full of aristocrats and accused a seemingly respectable woman of terrible crimes. You risked everything on the chance that justice might prevail. That took extraordinary courage, Emma. Never diminish what you accomplished. Emma nodded slowly, accepting the truth of her sister-in-law's words. She had been brave when bravery was required. She had trusted her instincts when everyone else had dismissed them. And she had fought for a child who could not fight for himself, refusing to allow fear or social pressure to silence her. The door opened, and Theodore entered with Edward clinging to his neck and Charles riding on his shoulders. William followed close behind, and all three males brightened when they saw Emma waiting for them. "Mother," William said, using the title that had gradually become natural to him over the past years. "Father says we might travel to London next month if you approve. I should like to see the British Museum, and the twins are old enough now to tolerate the journey without becoming too fractious." Emma smiled at the careful way William phrased his request, his vocabulary and manner reflecting the education and refinement he should have received from birth. "I think that would be wonderful. Perhaps we can attend the theatre as well. You are old enough now to appreciate Shakespeare." William's face lit with genuine excitement, and Theodore met Emma's eyes over their son's head with an expression of such contentment that her breath caught. This was what they had built together from the ashes of tragedy and deception. Not just survival, but genuine flourishing. Not just duty, but profound love. That evening, after the children had been settled in their respective chambers, Emma and Theodore sat together in their private sitting room, reviewing correspondence and discussing estate matters as had become their comfortable habit. But tonight, Theodore set aside his papers earlier than usual and moved to sit beside Emma on the sofa, taking her hand in his. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. The scandal, the social censure in those early months, the difficulty of taking on a traumatized child and a grieving widower. Emma looked at him with surprise. "Never. Not for a single moment. Do you?" "I regret only that I did not see Marguerite's true nature sooner," Theodore said. "That I allowed her to manipulate me for so long. That I dismissed you 5 years ago when I should have investigated more thoroughly. But marry you? Take on the challenge of healing my family? Never. You are the best decision I have ever made, Emma. You and William and the twins are my entire world." Emma leaned against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "We have been fortunate," she said softly. "Despite everything, despite the pain and loss and years of separation, we found our way to this, to each other, to wholeness. Not fortune," Theodore corrected. "Courage, yours specifically. You took terrible risks to save a child you had every reason to forget. You stood alone against power and wealth and social pressure because you knew in your bones that something was wrong. You transformed our tragedy into triumph through sheer determination and moral clarity." Emma smiled against his chest. "You give me too much credit. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Theodore said firmly, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "You did what almost no one would have done. And because of your extraordinary courage, my son is alive and thriving. I am happy beyond what I thought possible. And a woman who nearly destroyed everything I held dear is prevented from harming anyone else. You are remarkable, Emma. Never forget that." She kissed him then, pouring into that kiss all the love and gratitude and wonder she felt at the life they had created together. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Theodore smiled with the boyish charm that still had the power to make her heart race. "Come," he said, rising and pulling her to her feet. "Let us check on the children one final time before we retire. I find I sleep better knowing all three of them are safe and content under our roof." They walked hand in hand through the quiet corridors of Carlsford Manor, stopping first at the nursery where Charles and Edward slept in adjacent cribs, their small faces peaceful in slumber. Then they continued to William's chamber, where their eldest son sprawled across his bed with a book lying open beside him. Evidence of reading past his appointed bedtime. Theodore carefully marked William's place and set the book aside, while Emma pulled the covers over the sleeping boy. William stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible, and Emma bent to kiss his forehead. "Sleep well, my darling," she whispered. As they closed the door softly behind them, Emma reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From that terrible night 5 years ago, when she had held what she believed was a dead infant, through years of exile and disgrace, to the spring fair where she had recognized an impossible birthmark, to standing in a chapel and shouting accusations that could have destroyed her, to this quiet evening in a house filled with love and laughter and second chances. Some secrets refused to stay buried. Some wrongs demanded to be righted. And sometimes, courage in the face of overwhelming odds could transform tragedy into triumph, creating from the ashes of despair a future more beautiful than anyone had dared imagine possible. Emma took Theodore's hand as they walked toward their own chambers, grateful beyond measure for the life she had found through saving a stolen child. A life filled with purpose and passion, and the kind of deep, abiding love that made every risk worth taking and every challenge worth facing. The heir of Carlsford was home where he belonged, and so, finally, was she.